So in this video, I wanted to go over how I edit all up the images for my Instagram using presets I've developed. I've just came out with a preset pack of 10 presets, and I've also included a free one that you can just download off my webpage to try it out. They're based on a lot of the New York images that I've posted in the past, and they're good for a bunch of different lighting conditions and different subjects. The presets are developed specifically for Lightroom Classic on desktop as well as for raw file types. So if you're shooting on your phone and editing on your phone, then these unfortunately won't really work because they're developed specifically for the computer program, but if you are shooting raw file type and editing on your computer, then these will work great. So first I want to show how you install the presets. Make sure you have Lightroom open and then go to the Develop panel and make sure you have a photo imported. And then go to this left side panel and click the plus. Click Import Presets. Go to where the file is with the presets in it and then just highlight all the ones you want to import and then click Import. And then they'll show up on this left hand side here. So for this photo I want to use the New York preset, which is the one that's for free on my webpage. So right away you can see it made quite a few changes. Added some contrast, it faded the blacks a little bit, and it added some orange saturation and some blue saturation. The first thing I normally do when editing a photo is I like to crop it to a 4x5 to fit Instagram, unless I'm posting it to stories. So I'll crop it and make sure it's centered and straight. I think that looks pretty good. Then hit enter, and then the next thing I normally do is I make sure the white balance is set. So this looks a little too blue for me, so I want to bring up the temperature, make it more orange. So I'm just going to drag that up a bit. And yeah, I like how it kind of brings out those colors a bit. But now it looks a little too dark right now, so I'm going to bring up the exposure, maybe 3 or 4. And then I'm going to bring down the highlights to make sure the sky isn't too affected. So yeah, that looks pretty good to me. And then after, I'm going to go and tweak some more of the color specifically. So if you come down to the color panel, you can change any color you want and not affect any other ones. So I'm going to take down the oranges just because they were a little too saturated, and I'm going to make the reds a little more orange and a little less pink by changing the hue. And I'm going to bring down the saturation of the red a little bit. Let's see the before and after. So yeah, I think it's looking pretty good right now. Overall, I could easily post this, but I just want to show a couple more tips that you could do to this photo. I like to take out any distracting elements using the clone stamp brush up here. So then, I don't know if you can notice, but there's this little white piece on the sidewalk here. So I'm just going to take that out. So you just drag over it and then it'll sample a space that doesn't have the white piece on it. It's kind of small, but it was just kind of to show a point that you can remove distracting elements or trash out of your photos, and I do that in quite a few just because there's a lot of trash and stuff in New York. So, and then I'm gonna add a radial adjustment tool to this, and this lets you affect just a certain amount of the photo in an oval. So if you just click this tool and then click and drag it, and then if you press the O key on your keyboard, you can see where it's affecting specifically. So in the red, it's only affecting there. So I just wanted to bring up the exposure just a little bit, just to bring the viewer's attention to the center. So if you can see the before and then after, yeah, I kind of like that. I'm going to make it a little warmer as well. There we go. And I'm just going to bring down the highlights a little more. So yeah, it's kind of just to your taste and whatever you think looks good at the time. So here's the before on that photo, and then here's the after. So for this next one I'm going to edit, I just wanted to do a bit of a different scene from the past one. So this is obviously a snowy morning in Dumbo of the Brooklyn Bridge. So there's just a bit of the orange tones with the bridge and the brick building, and then the rest is very white with the sky and snow compared to the previous one where it was very dark and blue and orange. So for this one I'm going to use a different preset. I'm going to use number 3 Brooklyn Bridge. So as you can see, it kind of just brought up the shadows a little bit, brightened it up a bit, brought out the colors here more, and kind of just gave it a little more life. The first thing I noticed is that it made it a little too bright, so I'm going to bring down the exposure here. And then I'm also going to bring down the highlights to bring down the brightness of the snow in the sky. So I feel that looks pretty good. I'm just going to crop it to a 4x5. And then when cropping in general, I usually try and make sure that there's no distracting elements near the edge of the frame. For example, these posts over here, I try and take those out. You could also take them out with a clone stamp, but as a general rule, it's kind of good to not have any distracting elements that take away from the main subject of the frame. So I think that looks pretty good, and I feel the colors look good because the snow is very white and it's not too blue or too orange. So I feel it got the colors good. So the last thing I'm going to do is just go down and add a bit of a vignette. So I go down to the effects panel and then just bring this down to maybe -15, and that just adds a bit of darkness around the edge of the frame that brings the viewer's attention to the center, to the subject. This kind of works because use some leading lines in this shot with the building and the tables and the lights that lead to the Brooklyn Bridge. So having that emphasized vignette kind of adds to the photo. So here's the before, here's the after. So before it was just a little more flat and you didn't really have the color of the brick pop, and then after makes it a little more contrasty and brings out the oranges, but it doesn't add any color to the highlights, so it keeps the snow nice and white like I like. So for this last photo, I wanted to do an edit of more of a cityscape shot during sunset. So this photo was taken on the Manhattan Bridge looking towards the downtown Manhattan skyline over the FDR highway. For this one, I'm going to apply the number 2 preset, Lower East Side. Immediately you can tell I kind of made it more contrasty, added a bit of warmth to the shadows, a bit of teal to the highlights, and bumped up the oranges and reds. So first thing I'm going to do is crop it to a 4x5. And then I'm going to bump up the exposure just a little bit more. And then bring down the highlights to bring down the sky. And then bring up the shadows to bring out a little more detail in the skyline buildings. So I think that looks pretty good for exposure, but I'm going to bump up the warmth just a little bit on the temperature, just to make it a little warmer. And so yeah, after you apply the preset, the two biggest things to get right is making sure the white balance is correct and that you have the right exposure, and then go for further tweaks from there. But once you have those two things, then your photo should be pretty set in. After this, I'm going to add a radial adjustment to the skyline here. I'm going to just increase the brightness just a little bit to bring out some more detail. I'm going to bring up the exposure by 2 or 3 stops, and then bring down the highlights to make sure the sky isn't being affected too much. But yeah, so there's the before, and here's the after. I think the main thing to think about when editing photos is to kind of have something in mind when you take the photograph and kind of be true to what the scene actually was. Don't try and make it look too crazy or make it something that it wasn't. I think it's just important when you go out to capture the correct lighting and to get it right in camera and then enhance what it was that you captured. Yeah, I hope that these presets could be helpful and that you learned a little bit more about editing. If you have any feedback on them, let me know. And if you have any more questions about editing, then just send me a message.